Today, we're going to look at an old video from John Piper posted 14 years ago on YouTube, which addresses the question, why was it okay for God to slaughter women and children in the Old Testament? It's really two parts to Piper's response. So we're going to watch the first part. I'm going to offer a critical response, and then we'll watch a little bit of the second part.
Why was it right for God to slaughter women and children in the Old Testament? How can that ever be right?
It's right for God to slaughter women and children anytime he pleases. God gives life and he takes life. Everybody who dies because God wills that they die. So God is taking life every day. He will take 50,000 lives today. Life is in God's hand. God decides when your last heartbeat will be.
What is so problematic about this response? The questioner was clearly asking about God commanding human beings and commanding human beings slaughtering women and children because he uses the term slaughter and it specifies about the Old Testament. The questioner is not just asking about why do people die, but rather why does God slaughter people by implication through the agency of other human beings in passages like Joshua chapter 6, let's say with the destruction of Jericho. Why did God command that? How could that be something God could command justly in passages like Deuteronomy 7 and 20? It's clear that this is what the questioner is talking about. They're asking about how could God command the slaughter of Amalekites, including infants, in 1 Samuel 15. Piper, in his response, is then clearly equivocating by moving and actually shifting the goalposts as well, by moving from what the questioner is really concerned with, which is how could God command certain instances of the slaughter of women and children as described in narratives in the Old Testament. And he's shifting to the general question of how God can allow anybody to die. Which is clearly not their question. It's not just generally about why is there suffering and death in the world. And notice as well how this is really disingenuous that this requires Piper then to describe every time a person dies that that person is slaughtered by God. Right? That he says, well, 50,000 people die every day implies 50,000 people are slaughtered every day. It's just the same kind of thing that the questioner was asking about in the Old Testament. So it's really a bad faith response, in my view. Now, a lot of apologists play this card essentially when they're addressing questions about God's actions, his commands, and commendations in the Bible, specifically in the Old Testament, and in passages like Joshua 6 or 1 Samuel 15, Deuteronomy 20 and 7. How could God command and commend such actions as these? And those are never just general questions about why is there death and suffering in the world? Why does God allow people to die? And so for Piper to answer it in those terms, again, I think is a disingenuous and bad faith response. Now, to Piper's credit, he then goes on and he says, well, there is a more difficult form of the question, which is why does God command people to do things like slaughtering women and children in the Old Testament? And let's now consider his response to that second question.
It's right to do. So the Bible says, thou shalt not murder. And God says to Joshua, go in and clean house and don't leave anything breathing. Don't leave a donkey breathing. Don't leave a child breathing, a woman breathing, an old man or a woman or a donkey. Just wipe out Jericho. And so then my answer is, there is a point in history, a season in history, where God is the immediate king of a people, Israel. Difference in the way he is the king over the church, which is from all the peoples of Israel and does not have a political, ethnic dimension to it. So there was a political, ethnic dimension. He is immediate king, and he uses this people as his instrument to accomplish his judgment in the world at that time. And God.
So the gist of Piper's response, the gist of his response is to say that there was a time in history where God was the immediate king, and he used human beings, the people of Israel, as his immediate agents to bring about his judgment on other human beings, but he doesn't do that now. So that's the gist of the response. Now, some problems with that response. Here's one problem. That response, of course, requires us to say, okay, so it's not intrinsically wrong to massacre women and children on Piper's view. It all depends on whether God, on this occasion, is using a particular human being as his immediate agent of judgment in the world. Uh, Now, Piper says, well, God no longer uses the church as his immediate agent of judgment, in the way that he used Israel at this time. But Piper doesn't really give any definitive reason why that would be the case, nor does he give any definitive reason as to why God might not use the church as his immediate agent of punishment in the future. And I have met and spoken with Christians who have a broad theology like Piper's. One of them was a former colleague of mine, an Old Testament scholar, who agreed with me when I asked him about this, that God could indeed, in the future, based on his view of the reading of the book of Revelation, God could use human beings in the future to become his immediate agents of judgment on other human beings and engage in direct acts of killing of women and children in the future, just like he did in the past in Jericho. And this is, to my mind, a pretty horrifying and shocking position, but it is a reasonable implication of Piper's view. If it is not necessarily wrong to massacre women and children and infants, then if God has commanded it in the past, in principle, God could command it again, such as in the coming apocalyptic judgment of the wicked. So that's one implication here of Piper's view. Here's another one. If God can commandeer people to become his immediate agents of judgment in the world, over what range of ways that people suffer and die could God employ a person to be his immediate agent of judgment? For example, in the entire clip here, Piper references at one point that God drowned almost all the people and animals on the earth. So drowning was one of the modes of punishment that God brought about to kill people in the world. Does it follow then that if God has directly drowned people, that he could commandeer and command his followers to drown human beings, not just to stab them and smite them and slay them with swords and spears, but to drown them, to hold them underwater and drown them? Why not? I mean, it would seem to be an implication of his view. What other ways have human beings died that Piper could potentially interpret as an immediate divine judgment of God? Um, and which range of those ways could potentially be ways that God commands or could command his followers to bring about judgment immediately on other human beings? I think what follows here is just a theory of moral chaos, which is so fundamentally contrary to our most fundamental moral intuitions about the true, the right, and the beautiful, or the good, the right, and the beautiful. And I think that we should just reject at the outset this kind of apologetic. So to conclude, Piper gave us a twofold response. The first response, I think, is to equivocate and to shift goalposts. And the second response, when he actually addresses the questioner's question, how could God command human beings to slaughter other human beings? He has no good answer, apart from saying, well, sometimes God commands human beings to do horrible and atrocious things to other human beings. But because God commanded it on this instance, it's not morally abominable. And I think, again, that therein lies the way to moral chaos.